So, welcome back to SolarFest Live. Um, this is a homecoming of sorts. Dr. Ginsburg first met Melissa Chestnut Tangerman in Kenya in 1983 while he was studying endangered Grevy's zebra. Um, and he's been good friends with Melissa and Robin ever since because, as she says, Josh is really good at people and causes and the natural world. So we are very fortunate to have Josh, the president of the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, and his colleague, forest ecologist Dr. Charles Canham, here to discuss the pitfalls and prospects for forest carbon offsets as part of a net zero economy, including recent research that shows this may be harder to achieve than expected. Before they begin this conversation, we'd like to thank the Regenerative Food Network for their support of SolarFest and for making this presentation possible. RFN is a catalyst for the good food system by identifying local partners that are doing great work in their communities and empowering them with the finance, infrastructure, and technology. There's more available at regenfood.net. So now sit back and enjoy this discussion, and please enter your questions or comments into the chat using the button at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll hope to have some time to address your questions. Thank you. I'm turning it over to you, Josh.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for coming. It's a real sign of your commitment to the natural world and to our role in trying to make it a better place that you've given up an hour on this stunningly beautiful summer day when it is not raining for the first time in God knows how many weeks. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and we're going to just dive into the conversation. You know, the idea of a carbon credit or an offset has been around for a while, but we're not going to make any assumptions. So Charlie, could we kick off by, just talking about what a carbon credit or an offset is and how that works into the idea of a net zero economy?
Well, sure. So there are two parts of that. Well, forest, you all know what a forest is. So there are credit and offset. So the offset part first. As I'm sure you're all aware, natural ecosystems on the planet, oceans and land, take up carbon from the atmosphere, primarily through photosynthesis, sometimes through physical processes, and store it. And for instance, the oceans are offsetting about 26% of the fossil fuel emissions currently going up into the atmosphere. Land is sort of a net flux of about 17, a net storage of about 17% of the fossil fuel emissions, but that's because there's a lot of carbon being taken up, but there's also a lot of carbon being released from the land through things like deforestation and fire and so forth. So that's what an offset is. So natural processes are offsetting the emissions of carbon from human activities to a significant degree, to the point that roughly around 44% of the fossil fuel emissions from humans to the atmosphere are being offset by natural processes on land and water. The credit part is where financial markets come into play, and in which someone tries to figure out a way to take credit for what their land, and to some degree, even some nearshore marine environments, this notion of blue carbon, take credit for what their land is sequestering, what it's taking out of the atmosphere, and then be paid for it. And so, this idea has been around for decades. It has really taken off in the last 10 years as the markets have developed to the point where there are now many, many different brokers trying to set up these deals. I think there's also been a lot of interest, I think somewhat misplaced and exaggerated interest in how to enhance those rates of offset. So you hear the term natural climate solutions. The Nature Conservancy is very fond of this term. The notion that through market mechanisms, we can dramatically increase the amount of carbon that natural ecosystems are taking out of the atmosphere. It's a lovely thought. I find it almost thoroughly unrealistic when you dig into the methods in the papers that lay out these arguments. you realize, for example, that the way that they come to a conclusion that there's a significant potential increase in the forest carbon offsetting is by halting all logging on natural forests around the planet and then replacing all of that harvest by taking new land and converting it into short rotation intensive forest plantations. So within the US, doing this would probably require that you created new forest plantations equal in size to all the forest land from Pennsylvania north, for instance. So forests in the US currently offset about 11% of carbon emissions from, according to EPA estimates. This is incredibly important. The question is, how stable is it, and can these market mechanisms enhance it?
Great. I realize I skipped over one question that I was going to ask you, so I'm going to go back. You know, your knowledge of forests is deep and broad, and I would say that you're a forest ecologist who studies both the forest and the trees. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you got interested in forests and how that led to your fascination with this issue.
Well, I am recently retired from the Institute, at least nominally. I still have 2 books I'm committed to writing about forests. And one of them will be about this issue of the role of forests in a net zero and sustainable future. I was on the staff at the Carey Institute for 37 years. I joined the staff right after it was formed, just as a fresh PhD from Cornell, or a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. And the unique thing about the Carey is that essentially I had a full-time, hard money, pure research position, and I have a short attention span. So I was able, with that freedom, to do research mostly in temperate forests, some tropical forest work in many different parts of the world. But my first love and the bulk of my research has been in the forests of the eastern United States. And I would just say that for about 10 years, actually, my lab got shut down, and I was a little offended. Josh turned it into a coat closet for our new conference center. After 20 years of hard research in my lab, it was converted to a coat closet, but an important coat closet, I'm sure. But for many years now, the primary data source I've been using has been the remarkable data sets maintained by the US Forest Service as part of the National Forest Inventory. And that's where much of the information we have about the role of forests and the response of forests to climate change. So and my involvement in this came from work with a lot of nonprofit environmental groups on which I've served as a board member over the last 25 years, ranging from a Nature Conservancy chapter to a land trust to an environmental advocacy group. And all of those organizations are always looking for new ways to fund conservation. And these forest carbon offset markets sort of came to the fore as a potentially very lucrative way to fund the work. The problems, as we'll get to, are that the methods that have been set up grossly exaggerate the credits, and I have become very disappointed about essentially the way that these markets are being used. So
yeah. Thanks, Charlie. And for folks who don't know the Forest Inventory Assessment data, FIA data, it is what, 300,000 5-acre plots?
Well, no, there's one plot for every 6,000 acres of the US. And if the plot doesn't, they're randomly located. And if the plot doesn't land in a forest, the crew's happy and goes home. And so they're the size of the plots, they're actually fairly small plots, and their locations are secret by law to make them, but they are very rigorously sampled with exceptional sort of field crews and data management. It's really a really remarkable resource.
And the reason I pointed that out is just to say, this is really, Charlie is a man of strong opinions and holds them tightly, but bases them on data until the data tell him something else, right? And so this is not, my facts are better than your facts, since we now live in a world where everybody can have their own facts. These are data that have been collected for decades, and so I think really do inform both ideas and opinions. So you talked about initially, and then in that last answer, that last question, this issue of whether these offsets and carbon credits that are being sold are legitimate. And, one of the concepts that sort of is central to that, I think, is this idea of additionality. And, how can somebody, go about proving that their action that they are taking will lead to additional carbon being stored, and whether that's forest related or otherwise?
Yeah. Well, the background for this is that pretty much everybody who's been involved in this issue and these markets has agreed that to get credit for having done something good for the environment, your actions and the money you spent have to have somehow increased the rate of carbon sequestration. So forests in the eastern US, for instance, are adding an average of about 2 metric tons of biomass per hectare per year. So just think of that number 2. Now, the question is, can you ratchet that curve up slightly by paying the landowner to, for instance, change their management? And that's the concept of additionality. Now, I have to say, this is an odd position for me, but I don't have any objection to paying the landowner for just continuing to protect their forests and sequester 2 metric tons per hectare per year. But it doesn't benefit the environment. In other words, that business as usual is going to happen whether or not you pay that landowner, to be honest. And so the standards that exist are in principle designed to only give the purchaser of the credits credit for how much additional carbon is stored. Now, in practice, the only way that landowners increase their carbon sequestration is to reduce harvests. And this is, and it is true that on a particular piece of land that's already in management, by reducing the harvest, you can nudge sequestration up. You're not removing that biomass, and the forest will continue to accumulate carbon. The problem is what's known as leakage to the economists, and that's if you take your 1,000 acres out of the working forest land base, does that just mean someone else logs their land? In other words, do the market forces in the marketplace, the demand for timber products, does that simply displace? And this turns out to be really hard to measure. So it's timber markets are notoriously unpredictable, fickle. If you've tried to buy lumber at the lumber yard or furniture that needs wood, you know just how crazy things are right now. There's no shortage of supply of trees in the United States. It's in other elements of the supply chain, but nonetheless, it's not at all clear that you can pay someone to stop harvesting their land and not trigger greater harvest somewhere else. And even, if you step back, the even bigger problem is simply that for decades, we have been offshoring our need for forest products. And so, New York used to have dozens of paper mills scattered around New York State. We're down to 2 or 3. And where did those paper mills go? They went to Malaysia and Borneo and the tropics, where tropical rainforests were cleared and converted into short rotation, eucalypt and pine and other species. Is that really a net benefit to the environment? We can, in the US, feel good that our forests are growing more because we've reduced that demand for our paper mills. But if you did the accounting properly, you would say, well, we probably increased the net flux of carbon to the atmosphere. So this leakage problem is really difficult. And the market registries try to account for it, but to my mind, don't truly account for it. So.
Yeah, and those are problems that are not dissimilar to other substitutions, right? We look at manufacturing in China and we don't count it as part of our carbon footprint in the United States unless we pick up everything that's produced there, put a carbon footprint on it, and put that into our calculations. So yeah. The problem of leakage is I think widespread. There is, however, look, there's good news, bad news on this. So I remember when Mike Bloomberg and Carl Pope, right? So you have, industrialist, billionaire, and the longtime head of the Sierra Club getting together to write a book on why we can be optimistic about the future in climate change. And I realized that whatever one believed, right, from that book, that these two were working together to make an argument that corporations, local governments, state governments were able to move forward, even under the Trump administration, able to make real progress on the commitment. And then we had the corporates, and that was Bloomberg's argument, was that corporate actors could be good. But that's put a lot of pressure on CEOs of carbon dioxide spewing corporations who have their boards now, as happened with Exxon, right, screaming at them, and their shareholders saying, "Where's your net zero plan? How are you going to get to net zero?" And one of the cheapest ways, it appears, is to just buy some carbon credits, and if they're good carbon credits, you're not going to get whacked. But how do corporations and how do people who want to offset their own carbon, how do we do this in such a way so you make a decision that won't come back to bite you in 6 months or a year?
Well, the carbon market depends on buyers and sellers, but those buyers and sellers depend on two other parties. The first are the registries, the groups that establish the standards that say, yes, this is in fact how many metric tons of CO2 equivalents you have offset and prevented from being released to the atmosphere. The other are the brokers who sit between the buyers and the sellers. And again, in the last 5 to 10 years, the number of brokers and the volume of deals has exploded. And the registries, the two main ones, the American Carbon Registry and the Climate Action Reserve, and then there's an international one called Vera. They've been around for a long time. And, I have nothing but admiration for their effort to develop the standards. But the buyers and sellers need to have confidence that the protocols are accurate. And that's where this market has failed, in my opinion, based on the analyses I think I've done and that I haven't had anybody question me on. And so, that's really what I think we ought to talk about is what are the protocols that are used to calculate how many credits a forest owner can sell? And so, you want me to jump into that one?
Yeah, and maybe these accounting problems are as it were deep and wide, and so maybe a specific example, the TNC project with the Albany Waterboard comes to mind as one that is illustrative and local.
Yeah, and this is spelled out in a blog post on the Carey Institute website that I did last May, in which was sort of my come to Jesus moment when I realized I had been as a member of the board of directors of a forest that I'm incredibly proud of in Connecticut, that's done sustainable forest management for 100 years. We bought into one of these deals. It helped build our program. It provided endowment to maintain wonderful management of a forest for the future. And, if something looks too good to be true, you ought to look at it again. And it was only a couple of years later that I kept thinking, this can't be right. The calculation of the number of tons of offsets just doesn't add up. And so here's what the protocols allow. So this Albany Waterboard property was about 4,400 acres. It's a sort of classic water supply watershed. Some watersheds do actively manage the forest in their watershed, but most of them don't. And so these were mature forests adding a lot of carbon per year and had stored a lot of carbon over the last 50 to 100 years. Now, the way the protocols work is to calculate how much additional carbon you're going to generate. They don't say, what have you been storing over the past 30, 40 years? They say, what could you legally cut? And how much more carbon will there be on the land than what you could legally cut? Well, for almost all land in the United States, folks, you can legally clear cut every tree on your property. There are very few places where there are legal limits on how much you can cut. There are market mechanisms. Finding somebody to come in and clear cut 1,000 acres is really hard, and you get a lot of pushback from your neighbors. But the way the calculation is done is the silviculturalists say, let's assume we clear cut 90% of the Albany watershed lands over the next 10 years, and then let them regrow with doing, and how much, what's the difference between where they are now and what they're adding, and that new, liquidate the carbon stocks and then allow it to grow. So they're counting all of that carbon in there instead of the difference between this and this. And so it's a massive amount of carbon. And instead of getting credit, so again, let's go back to that current slope is about 2 metric tons per hectare per year of biomass. The total sequestration on average for northern forests is about 2 tons per acre per year, because you've got some storage in detrital biomass, you've got some storage in wood products and so forth. Even halting harvest, you might be able to increase that to 2.25. And so at $10 a ton, you're getting, your gross receipts are $20 a ton or $20 an acre per year. The broker takes 10, 15, 20% of that. There's an insurance indemnification. That's another 15, 20% of that. You're getting $5, $10 an acre, which might be enough to help you cover your taxes. And it's not an insignificant issue for a forest owner. But if you get credit for all of that carbon you've stored up for 100 years and you liquidate it, you get a couple $1 million check right up front for 4,000 acres. And that's real money. And that's what these brokers have been dangling in front of land trusts, and anybody with a couple thousand acres of forest, because they need that size just to make it worth the broker's time. They're basically holding out very significant amounts of money. Here are the problems. So there's no true additionality there. There was no plausible path under which the Albany Waterboard was going to clear cut their 4,000 acres and then allow it to regrow. In fact, what happened as a result of this deal is the Albany Waterboard gave somebody else the right to emit exactly that much carbon, as if they had just done the worst possible thing to their land, liquidate all the trees. And in fact, they gave them credit for all the carbon that had been stored over the last 50 to 100 years. It actually would have been better for the atmosphere to have Albany clear cut, because half of that biomass would stay on the land in the roots and the tops and decompose slowly, as opposed to giving somebody credit over the next 10 years for emitting 50 to 100 years worth of carbon. So this is the problem. Now, why is this built into all of the registries? I think there's a simple reason, and it is that you're asking this landowner to enter into a long-term deal that has to be verified at a cost of a couple dollars, maybe $4 or $5 per acre per year for compliance, for a deal anywhere from 40 to 100 years, depending on the registry. No landowner is going to enter into that deal if their income is only $20 a year and they have to pay the brokers and all these other things. So I think these organizations realized quite logically that there was no way to prime this market and to get it going at the $5 to $10 per ton offset price if they were honest about what the truly additional carbon sequestration was. It's just, so yes, carbon offset prices could increase. Maybe they get up to $50 to $100 a ton. And then you start to worry about how does that distort land use practices? I mean, the last 2 paper mills in New York State at Ticonderoga and Glens Falls are major parts of the upstate economy. If pulp all of a sudden costs, they have to compete at $100 a ton, they're out of business, and that paper production goes to Borneo. So there are a lot of problems, and basically, no one has been able to explain to me how to change this and to make these deals work financially if you do an honest assessment of the truly additional carbon sequestration.
So
Sorry,
Charlie,
that's long-winded, but
let me make sure I get it right. So there are fundamentally several problems here, right? The first is that a watershed or an already eased property that has a conservation easement on it, which is being managed, maybe even being managed for forestry, but perhaps not. But that fundamentally there is no scenario in this world where a watershed for a major metropolitan area is going to clear cut their forest, because it will lead to siltation of the water. It will lead to pollution. It will, be a really bad management idea. But nonetheless, they were paid for all the carbon that would have been released had they done that. So the first thing is you're paying them to do something that they wouldn't do anyway.
But let me stop you there, Josh, because this tends to push the argument into saying, well, you shouldn't do these deals on protected lands or land. That's not the case.
Okay.
60% of the forest land in the U.S. is private forest land, either individuals or corporations, and 60% of that is individuals. And the bulk of those people have no current plans to harvest, or if they do, they harvest very lightly and selectively and sustainably. So there's just very little land. So that if you're going to adopt a business as usual baseline that is legitimate, you should use broad categories, use the FIA data, and say, what is the practice for that forest type in this region with this market? And that's what drives timber use. You just can't, if you drill down to the individual landowner, you get into these what ifs. We'll say, well, I could clear cut all my trees, even though I've never thought about that. But if you offer me $1 million, I'll say, well, yes, I might clear cut my trees. And if you offer me $1 million, I won't, even though it never occurred to me to clear cut all my trees. Right. So it's just, I resist narrowing this down to just this limited landowners. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine. And the other thing that I think is really critical is this idea that the carbon that's been stored, what you are doing with an offset is saying to, if it's a compliance market and there's a demand that you reduce your carbon emissions in your gas-fired power plant or your, heaven forbid, coal-fired power plant, you are saying, okay, we're going to reduce our emissions by buying carbon over in the East Coast. And the problem with that is you keep emitting carbon dioxide on the business as usual goes both ways. And that's releasing a lot more carbon into the environment faster than if you had maintained the forests as they were, or even, as you said, if you cut it down. So I guess my question is, with these American Carbon Registry, right? Were there loopholes? Was it badly designed? What's the ARC's ACR, the American Carbon Registry's perspective on this, both the Albany project, but also more generally on the projects they're certifying?
I have had no interaction with them. I posted this blog. I mean, really, I'm almost embarrassed that it took me this long to realize that, it is a laudable goal to find market mechanisms to move, the needle on net emissions to the atmosphere. I'm if it's legitimate and it works, I'm all in favor of it. I also think that the family forest owners of the U.S. are my heroes. They've been managing forests well and sustainably, rarely harvesting intensively for generations. Some of them do and will harvest. The standard joke is, family forest is logged when the kids go to college or the owner has to retire, and that's part of the forest landscape. That harvest is valuable economically. It has ecological values as well. But at the broad scale, the forests of the eastern U.S. in particular have been steadily accumulating carbon. I have to point out that the story is very different in the West. Where fire and insects, all of the states, other than the 3 Pacific coast states, all the Western states are net sources of CO2 to the atmosphere because of the combined effects of fire and mountain pine beetle outbreaks and things like that. But here in the East, there's a lot of good happening. The question is, these, again, I can't, I was not involved in setting up these protocols. I just think that, as I said earlier, it's hard to see how these markets can work if you don't allow this kind of hypothetical but unrealistic assessment of baselines.
Right, and also you also pointed out the the price per ton is artificially low. I used to joke when I was teaching international environmental policy at Columbia, and we would talk about REDD++ and the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, and I would say the core problem is that a ton of carbon costs less than a Big Mac.
Yeah.
Right? Now
right.
It's slightly more than a Big Mac. Yeah, I think you'd have to get 2 Big Macs, but it's sort of crazy.
Yeah.
So there are other, you and I have talked, and I know you have a couple other concerns about what happens when you offset and what happens where that carbon offset is released and the carbon dioxide is released and other things that happen. And I was wondering if you just want to sort of, those things aren't talked about as often.
Well, there are 2 issues. The first is that you may be offsetting the CO2, but you're allowing the emitter, the industry that's emitting the CO2, to emit all of the other pollutants associated with their activity, primarily air pollution, but there's often water pollution associated. And there's just overwhelming evidence accumulating that this offsetting is disproportionately affecting disadvantaged communities and communities of color. That the industries that are allowed to continue to pollute are located in the proximity of those people, and that the health effects are measurable and really sort of horrifying. This is, there's a whole lot of new research coming out. It's really hard to do this research, like almost all epidemiological research, but the evidence is mounting rapidly that there's a real environmental justice concern here. And so both of those issues, in some ways, maybe we could resolve these accounting issues, get the price up, reduce the compliance costs, make it more lucrative for the buyer. We frankly need the price to go up because right now at $5 to $10 a ton, it's not incentivizing anybody to move to a carbon neutral, decarbonized pathway. It's just saying it's cheap, you can continue to do what you're doing. But if you can't solve these environmental justice concerns, and I don't see any easy way to solve them, then I think the accounting issues are moot. I think even if you could solve them, you still have an ethical dilemma that I think any industry going this path has to think very seriously about.
Yeah, and I think that last point in terms of disincentivizing a transition to a carbon free economy is really important. We know though, right, that no matter what we do by 2050 to get to net zero, there are going to be things that we do that emit carbon, and so these offsets are really important. And I you and I said in the abstract for this talk, I think in November or October of last year, this wasn't as important because the reality of having an administration that was saying let's try and get there, right, was debatable. But we now have an administration that is committed to this, and if we can hold on to that and keep it moving forward for 8 years, more than 4, but for 8, we might train this in the process sufficiently to make it real. Obviously, SolarFest was well ahead on this curve. I joked before that in some ways, when SolarFest started in 1995, it was aspirational, and unlike today, when solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels and growing very quickly, back then it was aspirational. And I think the two together, that we have real alternatives and we are disincentivizing those alternatives by making cheap offsets is really important. So you did say early on, and I really like that, we might pay people to manage their forests well, not on a per carbon ton basis, but just because we know they do good things for water retention. We know they do good things for air quality. We know they do good things for carbon, right? And I was just wondering, what would be a better framework perhaps than the credit offset to get us there?
Well, I think you need to step back and just ask, well, you have to acknowledge the importance of forests as an offset for the nation's CO2 emissions and the globe's CO2 emissions. And then the question is, can you increase it? Maybe slightly. I'm very skeptical that you can do a lot in the US. Certainly in the East, I think it's very hard to move that needle. The West is a very different problem with fire and so forth. But how do we protect it? How do we keep from losing from that curve going down? And so again, you know, look at the fires burning in Oregon, California. Look at pests and pathogens threatening the eastern forest and the western forest. So I would, you know, to me, from a public policy perspective, the question is, let alone climate change threats on these forests. So I am more concerned about keeping us where we are and figuring out ways to help landowners protect and manage the resilience of their forests so that they continue to provide the many benefits they provide, not just carbon. Our forests are far too valuable to think of them as simply carbon sinks. They provide too many other resources, both ecological and economic and social as well, and just emotional resources, to be honest. Many of us just love being out in the woods. So I spend more time worrying about how to just keep our forests healthy and resilient and providing these benefits, and see relatively, so for instance, I have a great respect for professional foresters. They get a lot of flack. They're really bad at PR. They're tired of being beaten up. And so, you know, I think really good managers can but the first thing foresters learn is that things take time. You don't manage for tomorrow or the next decade. You think about what you can do over 50 or 100 years. And, you know, I do think there are ways to think about using silviculture over a very long time frame to increase productivity. So for instance, in eastern forests, there's an almost linear increase in productivity with biodiversity, with species richness of trees. Right, so maintaining diversity in your forest, it has clear benefits, and avoiding going to, you know, to just monodominant stands. And so, you know, there is a role for silviculture to play here, but frankly, even just an unlogged, a completely protected forest, you know, the analyses I've done with the FIA data show that we have at least 50 to 100 more years of steady growth if the insects and fire and climate change don't kill that. And so I have not been able to come up with, I'm not an economist. I don't understand economics really fundamentally. And I just have not seen any proposal that I think realistically moves the needle significantly from that 11% that we're currently offsetting. You know, doubling that, I just don't see any way to do that. I think I'm more concerned about seeing it reduced. So I'm sorry to be pessimistic about that, but I've been studying these forests for a long time, and I have great respect for their resilience. But you know, the land base, the forest land base, we have about 700 million acres of forest in the US. That number has been remarkably stable for 20 years. Now, not all that forest land has trees on it because it just burned or just got wiped out by an insect, but it's really hard to see in the US, particularly in the East, that land base can increase. So I think I saw somebody in the chat pop in a question about tree planting. And this is the other action that's often mentioned, that we just need to go out there and plant a lot of trees. And that billion tree proposal came out of scientists at ETH in Zurich. I have good friends there. It's a great university. They do great work on forests. That work has been roundly criticized by the rest of the scientific community as unrealistic, the kind of back of the envelope calculation that looks good in a short paper, but that doesn't hold up. And it's just very hard to see in the East that there is, what I find really more than passing strange is that the Nature Conservancy has really been pushing this issue. Now, this is an organization ostensibly devoted to conservation, one of the rarest habitat types in the East is the disappearing old fields, those abandoned agricultural lands that have now become our forests. They were habitat for all sorts of species, and that habitat is disappearing. It wasn't here 500 years ago, but for a couple hundred years, it was a big part of the landscape. And in order to significantly increase the amount of forest land and forest carbon sequestration through planting, you'd have to be finding land to either take out of agriculture or this sort of fallow, abandoned agricultural land, of which there's less and less because it already has naturally grown up to forests. So I just see not only very little land available, but a question about whether from a conservation perspective, we want to plant every acre of land that's not in a with an urban, suburban, or agriculture. Do we want every acre of land to be planted to trees again? Maybe. I'm not convinced. I'm about as much of a tree hugger as anybody, but I'm not convinced that that's the right path.
So before I go to questions, I just want to ask anything else on voluntary carbon markets or anything you want to add in, or you think you've or as it were done?
Well, I'm going to be really interested. As I said, this was really a revelation to me when I saw through my role as now a former TNC trustee, chapter trustee, when I realized what was being done, and as a trustee of a land trust that the Conservancy was working with, they had to reveal how these calculations were done, and then it was like, wait a minute, that's not right. This just isn't right. And there's a lot of money at stake here. And there are a lot of people with a vested interest in seeing these markets continue. I'll be interested to see whether there are any changes. I have not seen any sign of changes in the protocols, but I'm just one voice, and there's certainly a lot of other organizations, a lot of reporters are following up on these issues pretty keenly, and I think a lot of people share my concerns that we need to rethink this whole market.
Yeah, and I'm going to do my only shameless plug of the afternoon, which is if you want to read Charlie's thinking on this, his blog at caryinstitute.org. So there's no E in there, caryinstitute.org on rethinking forest carbon is, I think, a good place to start. One of the questions that's in the chat is, how do you help, in a heavily forested state like Vermont, what do you do to help, monetize protection of the forest? And you mentioned one thing earlier I want to sort of poke at. There are a number of reasons why understory is really not recovering, and you've studied several of them.
Right.
And I was wondering, would there be a way to help people do a better job, both with carbon and with all the other things that forests do for us by, valuing restoration of understory and diversity? Yeah.
Well, sorry, getting more hunters out there to get the deer browse problem under control. Regeneration is a problem in much of the Northeast and in much of the East. And so a healthier understory would lead to higher productivity and more carbon sequestration. There have been lots of organizations working to update forest tax law. So taxes on forest land are an issue for a lot of forest owners, and finding ways to compensate landowners for the public benefits their forests provide, not just carbon, but all the many others, wildlife habitat and open space, just simply to help them cover the costs of their stewardship. Again, I think people who are steeped in how to craft policy can probably come up with a way to do this in ways that don't have all the wrong disincentives and so forth. And so again, I study trees. I have great admiration for the people who try to craft policies that work. And so I'm not going to venture too far into suggesting, what kind of forest tax law changes would be the most effective. But there are programs like that. New York has been trying to get this done for a number of years. And,
right.
And they keep just sort of stumbling at the finish line and not getting it done.
Okay. Ray asks, what impact will EAB or WAB have on carbon sequestration? Probably need an acronym check there.
Yeah, well, in emerald ash borer, this is just horrifying. I use white ash in the small sailing dinghies I build. It's an important tree in the east, and we have it's an even more important tree in swamps. Black ash, the ash used by Native Americans for basket making, for instance. And the emerald ash borer appears to be capable of largely eliminating all of our ash species from the continent, and it's happening really rapidly. This insect disperses and flies farther and faster than any other we've seen so far. So it is truly horrifying, and not a lot of hope on the horizon. You know, there's just a long, very depressing litany of pests and pathogens. My colleague Gary Lovett, another program, Gary and I were on the staff at the Institute for almost exactly the same amount of time, and became nominally retired about the same time, because Gary got so fed up with just doing the research on the problems from these, he decided to try to do something about it, and has led an effort called Tree Smart Trade to try to stop the arrival of these pests and pathogens, which come in on solid wood packing and live plant importation. And Gary is one of my heroes for this effort. So, you know, it's hard. White ash is about 7% on a biomass basis of our forests. And one of the problems is that, you know, it's can be locally very abundant and wipe out a whole stand of, particularly on a base-rich soil, particularly a richer soil. But the rest of the forest sort of closes ranks and moves on. What we're just seeing really is the depauperization of our forest, the continued loss of key players, and reducing the diversity of the forest. So it's actually fairly hard to conclude that the carbon consequences are significant. The economic consequences, this is even more depressing to me, because the economic consequences of loss of white ash in forests are almost insignificant compared to the cost to street trees and urban areas, because having somebody come in and take down that tree can cost you a couple $1,000s, whereas the stumpage value of that tree might be $100 or a couple $100 in the woods. So, you know, the real impact of EAB is basically the enormous cost of you got to realize that a lot of communities planted ash trees after all their elm trees died 50 years ago. So in the Midwest, cities were going bankrupt, taking down all of their white ash trees in the 15, 20 years ago when it first arrived. And insects like mountain pine beetle in the West were just so pervasive, and lodgepole pine and whitebark pine are such big parts of the landscape out there that the mountain pine beetle was an enormous impact on carbon sequestration.
So that's a great lead into the next question, which is, you know, sort of a philosophical one. As the West burns, right? Mm-hmm. Which isn't to say that the East won't burn, because of course we have, you know, fire towers in the Catskills and the Adirondacks, and they're there because at one point there was a lot more fire. Mm-hmm. But as the West burns, does that increase both the value of the carbon in the East, but also give it greater incentives, not just to pay, as you said, for carbon that shouldn't be paid for, but to pay people to do conservation because it is more stable and more persistent? Yeah,
well, the East already provides about 85% of the carbon sequestration in US forests. I was actually surprised, but Mississippi and Alabama are the champions. Those southern, the native pine hardwood forests, they're glorious, and it's warm and it's wet, they're diverse. They store about twice as much carbon per acre per year as a northern hardwood forest in New York, you know, the forest I know and love. And so, you know, but every one of the Rocky Mountain states is a net carbon source. That's where I think tree planting, we don't have any hope here of coming up with answers to the fire management challenge that the Western US faces. No one, I have followed this debate for many years. It is about intractable a problem and one that has no easy answer that applies everywhere. Every forest type, every fire regime is different, and it's just abundantly clear. The data on this are just unassailable, that the problem is far worse because of climate change. It's just, hotter and drier. The Rocky Mountain West has showed the greatest temperature increase of any part of the U.S. outside of Alaska, and far more than the East. So they had just really had this double whammy of a landscape that's primed to burn because of a lot of reasons, and factors that just make it incredibly hard to control those fires. Replanting could have some benefits there. If a fire burns 300,000 acres and there's no seed source, it takes a long time. And a lot of those forests could, they're on a cusp of maybe switching over to becoming grasslands and shrublands. Some of you who know Yellowstone well remember the '88 fires. My undergraduate was at Montana State. Yellowstone is one of my favorite places in the world, and I've been back there a number of times, and there are parts of Yellowstone that after '88, now 32 years, 33 years later, still have not come back to forest and are mountain fescue or Calamagrostis grasslands, and might stay that way for 500 to 1,000 years. Our new forest ecologist, Carrie Winslow Hansen, works on this quite a bit. And so, I do think there is a role for thinking about how to mitigate and respond to those the fires that are happening out the West. It's a tough problem.
So Charlie, David Kona is I think a little depressed by our conversation. And, sorry, David. I mean, it is, I think the odd thing about Carey Institute and Carey Sciences is, despite all of this, we are deep optimists, right? We do have a feeling that somehow things will get better in many cases. And so let me just reiterate a couple of things Charlie said, and then Charlie, you can jump in. Number one, there are places both in this country and in the world where we've suffered serious deforestation, and where restoration work, not just planting monocultures, but restoration work could have a huge impact. I think of Borneo, which is 90% oil palm right now. And if we made a commitment to reversing that and taking oil palm, rubber plantations, a lot of the dominant non-native forest types in Southeast Asia, and diversifying them back, even with only maybe 30, 40, 50 species to begin with, right? It would have such a difference, because it would give you tropical forests are multi-layered. They have understory, mid-story canopy. They store a lot more carbon, and also, by the way, a lot of other benefits. So I think that kind of restoration probably is valuable. I think Charlie's point that out west, the combination of fire and pests has created huge gaps, and it's not quite like New England in the 1890s, but it's not that different. And Bill Cronin was a professor at Yale when I was there, and Bill sort of inculcated in all of us this idea that what we're seeing now actually is not what was there 100 years ago. And so I think the 100-year time frame that we can accelerate through active management is the one we should be thinking about. It's not a 5 or 10-year gig. It's 100 years or so. And it's better than, as Charlie said, the 500 to 1,000 years that natural perturbations will require for things to get better. But it's not a hopeless thing, but also just shifting the goalposts and saying, maybe reducing carbon emissions, maybe getting mechanical ways to move carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The National Academy just had a report come out on a really, really scary idea of shooting stuff up in the atmosphere to reflect sun, and what that could or couldn't do to the environment. And then there's a paper that's come out on the ecological consequences of that idea. But I think the reality is that if we can conserve what we got and get people to get paid to do that, if we can restore those areas where there is opportunity for restoration, we're at least not going backwards, and then we're looking for other ways to solve this problem. But climate change is not a unitary silver bullet phenomenon. It is dozens and dozens of really clever ideas. And convergence to solar and wind is a really good one. Charlie, you want to add anything in other than that?
Well, just one more factoid. So I'm a botanist, and it's embarrassing to admit that evolution has produced a process that is as stunningly inefficient as photosynthesis at capturing sunlight and converting it into usable energy. Yeah, so I've done this calculation a number of times, a number of different ways. So here's the factoid. You can produce the same amount of offset to fossil fuel energy production right now from an acre of a solar field that would take somewhere between 100 and 1,000, and more likely 1,000 acres of additionality and carbon sequestration on forest land to balance. So, you know, when you know, solar panels are just, you know, orders of magnitude more efficient. And not only that, they actually displace the fossil fuel energy production instead of just allow it to continue with an offset from the forest. So, you know, I just, as much as I would be delighted to see proposals that increase that 11% that we're currently offsetting with our forest land, I think it would be because we had healthier forest, hopefully, rather than that we were planting millions of acres of monocultures with all of their environmental problems. But I think the real answer is just decarbonizing the energy sector. And given how much more efficient something like a solar panel or a wind turbine is at capturing energy and offsetting and replacing, not just offsetting, but displacing fossil fuel energy production, you know, our forests are just too valuable to see them as just carbon sinks. To me, that's my take home message. They're important, but they provide too many other benefits. Let's just make sure they're healthy and resilient and can survive all of these threats without, you know, enslaving them to solving a problem that really needs to be solved a different way.
So I'm going to actually hand back to Mike on that, Charlie, because I can't think of any better thing to do than to have a factoid that points out how great solar is for SolarFest. You know, I really appreciate your insights, and also the fact that this isn't going to be solved by trees alone. And forests are wonderful places that should be conserved and protected for many different reasons. So thank you for that. Mike, thank you for inviting us to spend an hour with all of you. It's been great.